So we have come to the last section of this conference, and I'm pleased to give the word to Elisabeth Pacherie, who is talking about sense of agency in joint action. Please, Elisabeth.
Well, as the last speaker in this conference, I think first I would like to thank the organizers on my behalf and also on behalf of all the other people for this wonderful conference that put together and for inviting me, of course. So I talked today about the sense of agency in joint action. And let me start with an example from which I take from a little book by a famous American historian, William McLean, who wrote, among other things, this little book on the role of music and dance across history in human societies. And he starts this book with a little personal anecdote. He was drafted in the military in 1941, and he was sent for basic training in Texas. And at the time, the Americans were not yet in war. They were preparing for war, but basically they lacked weapons, and also they were supposed to be in the artillery. They didn't have any cannons. So the basic training consisted mostly in military drill. So here's his first impression. A more useless exercise would be hard to imagine. We drilled hour after hour, moving in unison and giving the numbers in response to shouted commands, sweating in the hot sun, and every so often counting out the cadence as we marched, which I won't attempt. But then he says after a few weeks, things started to change, and it somehow felt good. A sense of purposive well-being is what I recall. More specifically, a strange sense of personal enlargement, a sort of swelling art, becoming bigger than life, thanks to participation in a collective ritual. And then a few pages later, he points out the similarity of what he experienced with what happens in traditional communal dancing. Boundary loss is individual, and feeling they are one is a collective way of looking at the same thing, a blurring of self-awareness and the heightening of fellow feeling with all who share in the dance. So in these two examples of drilling and communal dancing, joint action brings participants a heightened sense of agency and a sense of we-ness, but at the expense of a well-defined sense of self. So the question we might want to ask is whether this is always the case, whether each time we're engaged in joint action we have this kind of transformation. And of course my answer would be no, that there must some special conditions have to be met for this to happen. So my main question in this talk will be, or the one I will try to engage with, is how our sense of agency is affected when we act jointly with others. And this divides into two sub-issues. The first I call the quality issue. Does our sense of agency undergo a qualitative transformation from self-agency to something we could call we-agency, or does it remain egocentric when we're acting together with others? And are self-agency and we-agency as subjective experiences polar opposites, or is their relation somehow more complex? Second question is, well, the quantity issue. When we are acting together with others, what determines the strength of our sense of agency? So basically, I'll start with a little, I'll be very brief on that, a little something on the sense of agency for individual actions and the various determinants of this subjective experience. Then I'll move to joint action, and I'll discuss the extra complexities that are engaged when we move from individual to joint actions. And finally, I'll go back to this issue of the phenomenology of joint action, the subjective experience of agency, and we'll try and tackle the quality issue and the quantity issue. So let's start with individual actions, or sense of agency for individual actions. And a first preliminary definition. So to have a sense of agency for an action is to have a sense that one is the author of the action, that one controls its performance and its direct effects, and is thus causally responsible for them, and probably also morally responsible for them, but I won't go into moral issues today. And it is a complex phenomenon because it appears that a variety of different processes shape our sense of agency. And empirical research on agency in the last 15 years or so has explored a number of potential agency cues. Most accounts emphasize a principle of congruence between desired or predicted outcomes and actual outcomes of the action. And the point on which different approaches or account differs concern the nature of the cues being compared, the nature of the processes involved in the production of the sense of agency, and also how closely these processes are related to the processes involved in the actual production and control of the action. And basically, two theoretical positions have defined the two ends of the spectrum of possibilities that has been discussed in the last 15 years. One is the model prediction view. On the model prediction view, when our model system prepares an action, it also makes precise predictions about the sensory consequences. And our sense of agency depends on these predictions and on how well the actual sensory consequences of our actions match the predictions. So on these accounts, there's a close relationship between the processes involved in producing a sense of agency and the processes involved in objective agency itself, in actually acting. In contrast, on the cognitive reconstruction view, the sense of agency is inferred retrospectively from the existence of a match between some prior thought and an observed action. And here the thought is that you have a kind of very general causal inference process that is not specific to action and agency, and that is basically a union process of inferring causal relationship. And this general causal inference process has no close relationship to the processes actually involved in the production of the action. In recent years, a number of further factors have been studied. So, for instance, there's a role for action selection fluency. People feel more of control in their actions when the action selection is smooth and easy, rather than when they have to hesitate between different courses of action. There's also a role of outcome magnitude, so typically the size of an action outcome modulates a sense of agency independently of temporal contiguity or of consistency between predicted and actual action outcomes. So if I press on a key and I hear a small sound, I won't have much of a sense of agency. If I press on a key and there's boom, my sense of agency will be stronger simply because the outcome is more important. And there's also outcome emotional balance. The sense of agency for an action is typically attenuated when the outcome has negative emotional balance compared to neutral, positive emotional balance. So in recent years, there has been a growing consensus that the model prediction view and the cognitive reconstruction view are not mutually exclusive, but they're complementary, that all these different views and all the different processes together contribute to a sense of agency. And the challenge that researchers are now facing is to develop frameworks specifying how predictive and retrospective inferential processes interact and how the agency cues they yield are integrated. So one way this could be done is like this, but I won't go into the detail. If we want to have some more information during the discussion period, I have to have a discussion period, so I have to move on. So let us move to joint action now. So the main assumption here is that presumably the sense of agency we experience for joint action also depends on the combination of internal cues derived from action specification and control processes, external cues, causal inference processes, and so on and so forth. So the mechanisms involved should be pretty similar. But there are at least 4 sets of factors that make the sense of agency for joint action a more complex phenomenon to investigate. First, joint actions come in very many different flavors. Second, the cognitive processes that are involved in the specification and control of joint actions are more complex. In particular, there's a need for coordination. Okay, and this between the agents, and this makes certain demands or cognitive demands that you don't have in individual action. Third, as I mentioned at the outset, the sense of agency for joint action has a qualitative as well as a quantitative dimension, whereas the sense of agency for individual action, basically you have more or less sense of agency and that's it. And finally, there are a number of external factors, additional external factors that may have an impact on the sense of agency experience, including things like social emotions, beliefs about social identities, and so on and so forth. So let us examine these various factors. So first, varieties of joint actions. So joint action, basically, minimally, you need 2 agents to have a joint action, but you can have many more than that. Second, certain joint actions, the agents are on an equal footing. In others, there's a weaker or stronger hierarchical organization. And so in many instances, interactions are physical, but more and more in our modern societies, the interactions between the agents are virtual using social media and whatever. In some joint actions, the role of the agents are specialized, like in the orchestra, for instance. In others, they're interchangeable, like for instance in moving a fridge down the stairs. Some collectives are transient, they only exist for a brief moment. Others are more long-term, like a professional football team. And some joint actions depend on the existence of institution. Others don't. So here you have really a number of dimensions of variations among joint action, which make them a rather heterogeneous family, so to speak. Second, regarding the processes needed for the specification and control of joint actions. For a joint action to be performed successfully, it is typically not enough that the participating agents control their own actions, that is, that they correctly predict the effects of their actions and make adjustments if needed, corrections if needed, if their actions is not exactly as it should be. But in joint actions, agents must also coordinate their actions with those of their co-agents so as to achieve their joint goal. And for that, they also must, at least to some extent, be able to represent their partner's actions and their consequences, let's call that other predictions, and use these predictions to adjust what they're doing to what the other is doing, let's call that dyadic adjustments. But that's not enough, because this is something that you find already in competitive in settings, like for instance, Nadal playing versus Federer. They have to be able to anticipate what the other is doing, but they're not acting in pursuit of a joint goal. So what more you need is the capacity to represent the combined effects of your actions and of the actions of your partners, so joint predictions, and use these predictions on these combined effects to monitor progress towards a joint goal and make adjustments when needed. So How this is achieved will depend on the type of joint actions and the type of complexity involved. So, to keep things simple, I will only contrast small-scale, typically egalitarian joint actions, and larger-scale, more hierarchical, typically more hierarchical joint actions. So in small-scale joint action, research has shown that a number of automatic alignment processes can induce the formation of shared representation in several individuals through phenomena such as physical coupling or perception-action coupling, and do so to some extent independently of whether these agents intend to act jointly. So to give you a few examples, you have things like interpersonal entrainment mechanisms. So if you have two people in rocking chairs with different eigen frequencies, so the rocking chairs are naturally balancing at a different rhythm, so they don't have the same cycle. The rocking chairs, the people will synchronize their shares and do that completely unconsciously. Same in conversations. You have all kinds of automatic imitation processes. People start gesturing in the same way. If you film them, you will see they will start bobbing their heads in rhythm. They will start using the same range of vocabulary, the same level of syntactic complexity, and so on and so forth, and do so automatically. And sometimes you will even have people, their accents will get closer. So when I speak with Belgian friends, I tend to speak with a weirdly French-Belgian accent. And one way actually some people have used that to study how long newly married couples would last. If there's good synchrony, you can predict that the marriage will last for a long while. And if there's poor synchrony or poor, actually the marriage will be typically shorter-lived. Another thing is, for instance, the detection of common or joint affordances. So people typically can use these affordances to produce convergent behavior. So to take Searle's famous shelter example, the presence of shelter and rain will have people behavior converge. People will run to the shelter to get protection from rain. And of course, there are also all kinds of stuff having to do with mirroring and model simulation, which also allows you to some extent to understand what the other is doing and predict what will happen on the basis of an observation of what they're doing at the moment. In addition to these automatic processes, you also have, of course, a number of deliberate strategies for aligning representations. And these intentional alignment processes, of course, include linguistic communications. We discuss, we negotiate, we agree on certain things, but also non-linguistic signaling and communicative actions, gestures, pointing, shared attentions, and so on and so forth. However, if we move now from those small-scale joint action, which involve 2, 3, 4, 5 people, to larger-scale joint actions, we encounter important limitations with the kind of automatic alignment processes that I was mentioning. Because these processes then may be of limited help because we do not necessarily have the visual access to the other actors that would be needed, because we do not necessarily know what exactly their tasks are, and even if we do, we cannot precisely monitor what tens or hundreds of other people are doing. So these automatic alignment processes encounter their limits. So how do we achieve coordination when a large number of people are involved, when they have limited shared perceptual information, when they have specialized roles of different types, and they might not know precisely what others have to do or how they do it? When we move to larger scale actions, typically further tools are needed for action coordination, and they may include things like pre-established scripts, various coordination artifacts, clocks, watches, traffic lights, phones, work songs, and so on and so forth, communication among agents, of course, also extensive practice, hierarchical organization with a division of labor, and the redistribution of these monitoring and control tasks, conventions, social norms, and so forth. So just to give you a single example, consider a symphonic orchestra. First, there's the conductor. The conductor does not produce sounds. I mean, at least during performance, during rehearsal, it's something else. Witness Toscanini's famous burst of anger. But his role is to monitor what all the other musicians are doing and give them a number of cues. Then we have a score. Typically, a symphonic orchestra does not improvise music. They have a pre-established script with each having its own specified task. There also is a division of labor beyond simply a division between the conductor and the musicians. There are specialized roles. As I mentioned, typically you can't ask a cellist to replace a clarinetist. And there's also a hierarchy with the different families of instruments, each having their leader and so on and so forth. And finally, typically, if you try to bring even very competent musicians together for the first time, the result won't be great. So you need rehearsals and lots of practice to get great results. So let us now move to what is supposed to be the main question of this talk. So how does that impact the sense of agency for joint action? And let me go back to these two issues, quality and quantity. So when agents are acting on their own, and when they're asked whether they experience a sense of agency for a certain outcome, for the effect of a certain actions, they're typically faced with a binary choice, me, not me, or at least asked to select a value on a scale labeled me at one end, absolutely not me at the other end, and so on and so forth, but it's typically a unidimensional measure. But what happens when people are acting jointly with others, and I ask you the same question? Now you're confronting an ambiguity. Is the alternative me, not me, or is it us, not us? Okay, when I'm asking you how much of a sense of agency or sense of control do you have about this outcome, is the you the individual, or is the you the group acting? Okay. In addition, it is unclear whether a sense of self-agency, me, versus a sense of we agency, we, is something that is mutually exclusive. So, and the second issue, which I won't go into very much here, is the quantity issue. So, what determines the strength of a sense of agency for a joint outcome? So, let's start with agentive identity. So, one hypothesis you may want to defend is a pure egocentricity hypothesis. The idea is that the sense of agency is essentially egocentric. Sense of agency is always about yourself to the exclusion of anyone else. And In contrast, you can try and defend a hypothesis of we agency. The thought being that in cooperative joint action, the sense of agency depends on control at the group level rather than on your own individual control over the action. So how do we try? So let me specify these hypotheses in slightly more detail. There are two ways you may want to argue for the egocentricity hypothesis. First, on the basis of a model prediction view of the sense of agency. And here the idea is that, okay, since the sense of agency depends on the congruence between the sensory feedback predicted on the basis of motor command and the actual sensory feedback, and since motor commands are essentially egocentric, okay, your motor commands are about your own actions, you don't have motor commands for other people's actions, then these predictions are typically also about your own actions. So if this is how the sense of agency is produced, it should be eccentric. The contribution of a co-actor might be experienced as external perturbations if they impact the perceived effect of your actions, or they may be ignored as irrelevant if they have no impact on the effect of your own actions. So basically the idea is that normally the model commands drive some predictions, and then you compare the predictions with what actually happens, and if there's a match, you have a sense of agency. The problem is someone else is also acting with having an impact on the effect of the action, and then it becomes less clear who did what and how much in control you were. The second way to defend the egocentricity hypothesis is through the cognitive reconstruction approach. On this approach, you have a process of causal inference, and you have three principles in place. The cause should precede the effect, the cause should be coherent with the effect or commensurate with the effect, and there should be no other probable cause around that could also explain the effect, what is called the exclusionary principle. But if we take this view, the presence of another agent could lead the first agent to infer that he or she has less control than when performing the task alone, because then it becomes unclear whether you should infer that this effect was produced by you or this effect should be produced by someone else. And finally, so basically, single agent, the action effects, okay, it's something you did, no problem. Oops. Two agents, action effects. Is it something you did? Is it something the other guy did? Your sense of agency should be reduced in these circumstances that create some ambiguity. On the we agency hypothesis, acting together cooperatively engages a set of coordination processes that allow agents to align their representations and to predict the combined effect of their own actions and their partners' actions. And these, in turn, might lead agents to evaluate a sense of agency at the group level, thus yielding the sense of we agency. So, basically, you don't just consider the predictions you make about your own actions, but also the predictions you make about the other actions and the predictions you make about their combined effects, and this drives your sense of agency. So these were theoretical predictions, but then we decided to try and test some of them. So we invented this little task. It's a very simple task. There's a circle that's moving back and forth randomly, and there's a cursor that is controlled by a joystick, and the task is simply to try and keep the cursor inside the circle. So to move the cursor so that it remains inside the circle. There's an individual version of the task, single joystick, and then there's a joint version of the task, two joysticks, two people. One controls movements to the right, the other controls movements to the left. All right? And in addition, because psychologists are usually, well, let's not say anything about psychologists, but in addition, psychologists like to play tricks on the subject, so basically you can add noise, and you can also deactivate joysticks, one of those. So what happens? In the individual version of the task here, what we found was that the judgments of control were strongly correlated with what we call visual motor coupling. So basically, to the extent to which what they did was matched with what they saw on the screen. Okay, normal. But in the joint task, the egocentricity hypothesis would predict a decreased sense of agency when the two agents are acting, that is, when the two joysticks are activated, because then there would be less correlation or less coupling between what you do and what you see on the screen, because some of the things you do are due to what the other agent is doing. Okay? And actually, what we found was the opposite pattern. Namely, we found that people had a strong sense of agency when both joysticks were activated, and thus when there was less sensory motor coupling. Okay? Suggesting that during complementary joint action, the sense of control depends on the amount of control exhibited by the group as a whole, and not the amount of control of the individual participant. So, in addition to this number of further factors that may influence quality, that is the agentive identity during joint action. The extent to which participation in a joint action induces a sense of we agency should also be modulated by the perceived importance of pivotality of his or her contribution to the joint action compared to the contribution of others. In addition, the perceived symmetry or asymmetry of their mutual control relations should also have an influence. How much power you have on the other compared to the power he has on you. And also asymmetries in action-relevant knowledge may also influence how much of a sense of we-agency we may have for a joint action. And finally, there are factors like motivation and social affiliation. So let me go briefly through some of these things. So one way to try and visualize that is to say that typically when there's a high symmetry in control relations, in the contribution of the agents, and also in knowledge, there should be a strong sense of we agency. In contrast, when there's a high asymmetry, you have two situations. Either you're the one who has an extra control over the action and whose contribution is more important to the other. And here, instead of a sense of we agency, you might have an enhanced sense of self-agency. You increase your own agency. The others are tools rather than partners. Conversely, if you're the guy being bossed around, have little control on what happens, you would not necessarily have a strong sense of we-agency. And in addition, your sense of individual agency may be decreased. So, in egalitarian actions, like for instance, say, a jazz trio, where there's an equal importance of pivotality of all co-agents' contribution, and a strong interdependence among agents, you should have some strong sense of we-agency. In situations that have a strong hierarchical components, typically agents higher up in the hierarchy should have more influence on the joint outcome, and a correspondingly enhanced sense of self-agency. While, so typically the conductor or the soloist should have a strong sense of we agency, or self-agency, sorry, because they have much control over the whole performance. In contrast, if you're the second cellist, your contribution to the joint action is relatively low. You could stop playing for a few minutes, it wouldn't change much. And you have little control over the performance, and here your sense of agency should be reduced. But then we must consider also motivation and social identity. But the very reasons that lead an agent to engage in joint action may also influence the way agency is experienced. So let's take the classical stag hunt here. You may engage in the stag hunt together with someone else for selfish reasons. Okay, each will get more food from one half of a stag than from a hare, so it's interesting. I mean, simply on your own individual interest. But it may be, on the other hand, that these hunters are members of the same clan and that are actually hunting to provide meat for some kind of banquet the clan is organizing. And in the second case, the hunters are acting on behalf of the clan, and the ultimate goal pursued is a group goal. A form of social or group identity can thus be salient from the outset and may influence the way agency is experienced. So take, for instance, these two situations. If cognitive cues, to the exclusion of motivational cues, were the only determinants of the experience of agency and joint action, we should, a participant in the Women's March in Washington just after Trump's election, to have experienced as little sense of self or we agency for their act of protest as a factory worker in Charlie Chaplin's movie, Manufacturing. I'm not sure whether they were manufacturing, probably not dishwashers, but typically sense of we or self-agency in that case was pretty reduced. But the participants in the march were probably more likely to attribute high emotional value to their marching, to identify strongly with the group and with the values the march symbolized. So typically they should have had a stronger sense of agency. Final example, because we're in Italy, football. But I will take the French, not the Italians. Okay, so we saw that how the valence of the outcome could have an effect on the sense of agency. It can also have an effect on whether we identify or not with the group. So, French example, 1998, France wins the cup, almost 20 years ago. And big explosions, more people in the Champs-Élysées, and after, then ever since the liberation in Paris in 1944, and everyone chanting, we won, on a gagné, on a gagné. Now, 12 years later, in South Africa, the French players are like spoiled children. They play badly, they behave in embarrassing ways, and they lose early. Okay, the French supporters, they lost. So, I should really stop. So I won't say something about the strength of the sense of agency. I would just, basically, the better you're able to predict the consequences of your action, not just yours, but also of your co-agents, the stronger the sense of agency should be. But I want to go back to where I started. So when do we lose ourselves in the collective? Let's go back to our first example of military drill. Close order drill is characterized by high similarity of roles and actions of coagents at all levels of action representation. It's characterized by close synchrony. It leads to high predictability, but also very low self-other discriminability. This is reinforced by a strong emphasis on the group ethos and the systematic erasure of marks of individuality. You wear uniforms, you have standard haircuts, you're not supposed to decide yourself what you're doing, you obey orders. In such a context, the experience of we agency may take an extreme form where self-boundaries and sense of self-agency appear to dissolve into the collective. But in many instances of joint actions, the sense of self-agency and the sense of we agency can coexist peacefully in an individual agent. Typically, this will be the case when the joint action allows both high self-other and joint predictability and also self-other discriminability. And when a team of workers is, for instance, building a bond together, achieving the joint outcome requires co-agents to perform coordinated yet different and complementary actions. And these kind of situations, you may have both a sense of free agency and a preserved sense of self-agency. So to conclude, or to recap, the sense of agency we experience for joint actions can vary in strengths, but also involve a more or less pronounced transformation of agentive identity, what I call quality. A number of structural factors, the type of joint action, and of cognitive factor, the type of processes needed for action specification, control, and coordination, will influence how accurately an agent can make self-predictions, other predictions, and joint predictions, and this will influence the strengths of the sense of agency. This will also influence how pivotal the agent's contribution is and how much control she has over the joint action, and this will influence the quality. How easily the agent can distinguish self-prediction from other predictions, and this will also influence quality. And finally, emotional and motivational factors will further modulate both the quality and quantity of agentive experiences for joint actions.